College Football Nerds here talking recap of the first round of the college football playoffs with my buddy Josh here. And we're going to eat a little crow because we got them both wrong. And Josh, I think we can start with Michigan and Alabama. That's where the most of the people in the comments are probably going to be coming at us. And people got a little mad on Twitter today because I think they wanted me to come hat in hand and say, man, you know what? We just missed this game. We missed Michigan. There are some things that I missed on Michigan that I want to get into a little bit later. But everybody kept saying, oh, you should have listened to your model. And I think there's a little bit of miscommunication or misunderstanding of how the model was actually a lot more wrong than we were. I picked the game Bama by 3. It was an overtime game. And the model was saying Michigan by 11 in regulation, which is not anywhere close to what the game was. Now, in terms of Vegas, it's very binary, win or loss, whatever. We don't really do that, though. Our preview is talking about how we think the game is going to go, how the matchup is going to go, and we give an actual score. And from that standpoint, a 27-24 score is not far off. As a matter of fact, if, for example, Corum slips on 4th and 2, Alabama wins that game by 7. I say all that to say, if you picked Michigan close, if you picked Alabama close, you were doing really well in your pick for this game. And something you like to talk about, and then you pointed out with Florida State Clemson this year, and I want you to touch on that. If your pick is still in play in the fourth quarter, you made a good pick. That's not necessarily bearing whether or not you got it right, ultimately, but you made a good pick.
I think at some level you have to accept the limitations of trying to pick the outcome of games between 18 and 20-year-olds with an oblong ball. And that's something that we've always tried to acknowledge, right? We use our model to give us a strong baseline. We always talk about it like a baseline or predictor. It's just trying to give us an idea of where these two teams are relative to each other. And our point with the model had been, with it favoring out Michigan by something like 11 points, that's saying Michigan was 11 points better in regulation. And there are a lot of people that are probably going to say, well, if X, Y, and Z hadn't happened, if we don't fumble a punt, etc., maybe we win by 11 points. That argument goes both ways. Alabama fumbled the ball themselves late in the fourth quarter trying to put it away. They had bad snaps, etc. The point was those two teams were pretty evenly matched. I feel pretty comfortable in saying that we were right to think that the model was overestimating the gap between these two teams in terms of scoring margin. The model did have the yardage differential more in Michigan's favor. That wasn't something that shocked us. And look, I got to come clean about something there too. Not many people know this, but I'm actually a double agent for Jim Harbaugh. You see that he's asked me, based on my track record, to pick against Michigan because I have a long practice tradition of being wrong in Michigan games, apparently. And he thought it was really valuable, given how good I am at being wrong, that I pick against Michigan in big games. And I was just trying to do my part here. But being a bit more serious, it is kind of funny that people talk about how we've been wrong on Michigan every single time, how we've picked against them all year. Guys, we picked Michigan to win 3 of their 4 games that we've done a video on prior to the Rose Bowl. The Ohio State game was the first time we had not picked them in that streak. I think people sometimes, I don't either, they only watch the big videos or just forget all the times we do pick Michigan and are right. But we have been wrong the last 2 times, and I think it's interesting to unpack that, talk about why we were wrong, how the game went the way it did. But ultimately, I think if you had any confidence in this game going one way or the other, and I'm sure a lot of people in the comments will disagree, but a lot of rational people will, obviously the margin here was razor thin. This was a game that was a very close game between 2 teams. We were 100% right to say that it was going to be a close game. We were 100% right to say, in our view, the thing that was probably going to determine the game is what version of Alabama showed up, what version of Jalen Milroe showed up. Because to some degree, a lot of this did come down to the fact that this was the mis-executing version of Alabama. And I don't see that as an excuse for Alabama in view of Michigan. It's more like that's who Alabama was every other game. And people pointed to the Auburn game and some of the other games, USF game. I mean, this clearly wasn't USF Alabama. They were a lot more effective than that. But our point had been, look, this Alabama was a lot of different teams. The LSU Alabama, Kentucky Alabama, Auburn Alabama, different teams. This was still a better version of Alabama in many ways than played Auburn Auburn is not anywhere near the defense that Michigan is, and if they played the level they did against Auburn, they probably don't score 20 on Michigan. But you did see that inconsistency, and they did, as they have done several times this year, they only played about a half of football. And yes, their ceiling is good enough that they could have beaten Michigan. A lot of Alabama fans will probably say we should have beaten Michigan, but that's not Alabama really at any point this year outside a couple games. They played the way they had all year, which was off and on football, and Michigan did exactly what we talked about in the preview. They capitalized on every error and every mistake. They played consistent football for fourth quarters. They executed at a higher level. And Alabama made enough mistakes that Michigan, slowly grinding away, was able to come down from back from a deficit, score, and then win the game in overtime. I mean, that is the nature of the game. That's how Michigan won it. And we can break down a little bit more maybe how exactly that works schematically and from a statistical standpoint.
Yeah, I think that, part of what we were saying in the preview was, Alabama would, in a lot of teams, for a lot of games, when you see a team making a lot of unforced errors, like they can't execute a snap, you think, okay, if that's happening in a game, we can chalk that up to not being who you are and maybe kind of excuse the victory for the other team away because that happened. What we're saying is Michigan doesn't do those things. Alabama does do those things, which are weird unforced errors and playing sloppy and disappearing for a quarter or two. And that's why Michigan won, which overall is just a different way of saying, like you said, that's who these teams are. Michigan was a better team. I do want to get into some specifics, though, in that I want to talk about coaching later because coaching really stood out to me a lot in this game. But the other thing that stood out to me was the quarterback play. And, we can visit the snaps, which also is a little bit of a function of quarterback play. But in general, Josh, to me, the difference in this game was you had two elite defenses, two lines of scrimmage that didn't dominate, the game. Like everybody's saying Michigan dominated this game in the trenches. Alabama ran for 220 yards. They more than doubled up what Michigan normally allows on yards per carry, average, and total yards rushing. So they held their own in that regard. Alabama did. The quarterback play in this game was starkly different. And yes, there was production for Alabama in the quarterback run game, but the inability to consistently pose a threat with a consistent offense. And I'm not talking about points, I'm talking about yards and staying on schedule and having a command of the offense was, to me, other than some coaching stuff, was the difference in the game.
I mean, the simple fact is Alabama's passing game netted 69 yards. And that's, if you take the amount of passing yards they had, subtract out the number of sack yards, that's where they're at. And that's, to say the least, not getting it done. 29 pass attempts, and that's all you net. Officially, it goes down as 5 yards per attempt. That's the college number. The NFL number is something more like 3 yards per attempt. It's pretty horrendous. And Michigan on their own, 221 yards on 27 attempts. That's 8.2 yards per attempt. The ultimate difference in this game is Michigan had a functional passing game and Alabama did not. Alabama in a lot of ways stayed in this game because of the earlier punt muff that gave Alabama a touchdown. If that doesn't happen, Alabama's really scraping to get their 13 points in this game. And it really all came down to the fact that if Alabama was ever in long down and distance, they had almost total inability to move the football. You mentioned coaching. Anytime a team is struggling to do something in one phase, it's never about one player or one issue. I do think Milroe had one of his worst games. There are a lot of opportunities where he missed things, but he missed things in a large part because of the schemes that Michigan was running. Michigan was smart enough to watch film, and they did not attack Alabama the same way Georgia did, where they dropped two guys as spies, floated. We talked about that in the preview, that we didn't think that was really a great idea. They were much more aggressive. They brought 4 to 6 guys most plays. There were a lot of plays I saw where they're bringing 6 men, which is a ton in pressures. And what they did is they just dropped coverage. They really insisted, as far as I can tell, virtually at all times that they were going to have 2 guys deep. And there were times where they would run, I guess technically it's a cover 2 shell, but it would be 3 guys in zone, like at the sticks, and then 2 guys deep over the top, so they could double anything running a deeper route. They bring 6 guys in pressure, and Alabama wouldn't get the ball off. And there are, that they had 6 sacks in the game, and I kind of went back and looked at them, or was watching the highlight, and it really struck me. I would say at least 2, maybe 3 of the sacks in this game were caused by high pressure plays where Michigan is intentionally leaving guys open underneath in the flats, and Alabama is not getting the ball off as a hot read. And that's the difference between the two quarterbacks. And I think it's a subtlety people don't understand watching live sometimes, that maybe aren't as into the X's and O's stuff. McCarthy, when Alabama tried to blitz, was very good at seeing the hot read and hitting it. There weren't many instances of that, and might go for like a 7-yard gain, but he would do it consistently enough that Alabama didn't feel like they could blitz because they knew they were just going to give up free yardage every time. Michigan, with almost impunity, knew they could bring pressure because it was unlikely that Alabama would get the easy play. And that meant every time anything went wrong, or just any time they were in passing situations, Michigan was able to attack. Michigan was able to generate sacks. Sometimes, yes, they did win the line of scrimmage because their defensive front did generally win against Alabama's front. But I think what people necessarily miss, or sometimes miss, is they did that because they weren't always bringing 3 and 4. If they're bringing 3 or 4 guys, the times they did that, they didn't generate crazy pressure. But you can bring more guys when you're in that situation. And I know one of the late sacks in the game in particular, fourth quarter, Alabama, took a sack after they'd had an illegal substitution, and they're trying to drive to score a touchdown, ended up kicking a field goal to go to 20. Michigan brought 6 guys on third down, and they left uncovered Alabama's tight end, Niblack, right over the middle of the field. And all Alabama had to do was snap the ball, turn, and throw it to him over the middle of the field, and he has the first down, if you go back and look at it. But the coaching staff knew how Alabama reacted in those situations. They didn't sit back and play passive football like Georgia did. They attacked Alabama. Alabama's offensive line held up for a brief moment, but then caved. And quite frankly, in this game, Milroe kind of reverted to what he'd been early in the year, where he's looking and staring down deep balls, and he is not reading or reacting to pressures. So the ball didn't come up, and he took a sack, kind of just step, pulled the ball down, and then went forward and just kind of walked into a guy, took a sack, and went down. And to me, that was the story of the game. It's a combination of Alabama's offensive line, Alabama's quarterback play, but also a Michigan coaching staff that knew what they were doing, knew from film how they needed to scheme things, and put Alabama in the situations they didn't need to be in, so that Milroe was making the kind of decisions that he's bad at and the kind of timing that he's bad at, and never gave him the reads that he wanted to have. So as you said, it's a lot about being outcoached, but it's also a lot about the year-long development of these programs, knowing where they're at, knowing how to have counters. And Alabama was a lot more one-dimensional schematically in a way that was crippling, and in a way I will say Michigan offensively was not.
Yeah, and I was impressed. I was thinking about these two rosters, and Alabama obviously recruits at a higher level than Michigan, but there is something to be said for both Michigan and Washington winning their playoff games against higher, at least on paper, talented teams that might put more guys in higher rounds of the NFL draft, but aren't nearly as experienced, senior laden. And we see this a lot in college basketball, where you have a couple of super seniors that are good. It can change the entire dynamics. Well, I think this is what we've seen with a consistent coaching staff at Michigan and a lot of guys that have bought into that system for a long time. I think that allowed them to really make drastic, not changes, but adjustments and schematic, implementations with their month-long layoff to really scheme wins on both sides of the ball. Michigan didn't try to go head-to-head, athlete for athlete against Alabama, which is what a lot of teams have tried to do for years against Alabama, against Georgia, and it doesn't work. Michigan tried to do that 2 years ago against Georgia, and it didn't work. What they did was they said, we don't have to have a top 10 wide receiver beat your top 5 pick, corner heads up. We're just going to scheme him wide open. And that's what they did. And it kept Alabama on their heels the whole game. I didn't think the run game was too big for Alabama, but it did enough to keep them honest to where the things that they actually earned in terms of scheming guys open, like we talked about before, you earn those trick plays. You earn busts. They earned a lot of those coverage busts from coaching and from taking that month and having this malleable group who's already super solid on the fundamentals, that they are able to layer in those extra things that won the game for them. Whereas for Alabama, I think that this month layoff, they're probably still working on the fundamentals. They're not able to introduce certain things because they don't have the guys that have been in the system that long. Remember, it's a first-year DC, first-year OC, and a first-year starting quarterback. But in general, we had Alabama winning, and they very well could have won this game. But I think it would have been more because the special teams that Alabama was clearly superior at and just their ability to run the ball. But as an overall unit, I think Michigan was the better team. And I don't think that last touchdown drive was a fluke to put it in overtime. And we saw the difference in when Michigan needed to scheme up something on 4th and 2, what they did versus what Alabama schemed up on 4th and 3. The limitations that Alabama has at quarterback right now, they don't trust him to throw the ball, and his eyes were wide as saucers in this game. So yeah, all credit to Michigan. We missed this pick. We have become somewhat of a good luck charm, and it's become a meme, and that's okay. I'm happy to provide that service for Michigan fans. Anything else you want to touch on in this one before we move on to Texas and Washington?
Yeah, I want to touch on really two statistics that I find interesting and really telling. The first is tackles for loss, which is any tackle behind the line, including sacks. It's not just that Alabama was sacked 6 times in this game. Michigan led TFLs 10-1, which I don't think people fully appreciate, right? There were 59 plays by Michigan, and they took 1 TFL. There were, I think, 66 plays for Alabama, and they took 10. So the difference in 1 in 60 plays going for a loss and 1 in 6 is pretty stark. The difference these two teams were in terms of execution, but more than anything, you can talk about Michigan's offense not being flashy, but it didn't ever go backwards. And that can't be understated. And then the second thing I will say, something I found was pretty interesting was the differential in actual rush attacks. And when I mean that, I mean rush yardage from the backs in particular, traditional running game. Corum ended at 4.4 yards per carry with a long of 21. Donovan Edwards only had 4 carries in this game, 2.8 yards per carry, 11 yards total. Neither one ran particularly well, and it felt like a lot of people were saying that Michigan was dominating the line of scrimmage, or I'll be the one to own that I made it kind of a dumb tweet on the second drive. But what I was noting is that Alabama running the ball was being extremely effective, to the point that it was surprising me, because I didn't think they were going to be able to turn Michigan's defensive front, but they were doing so on a consistent basis. Michigan was not, and they did not run very well. They didn't really the entire game. And what I find really striking, Alabama's McClellan averaged 6.2 yards per carry. Haynes, the backup, who was a true freshman, really hadn't played all year. He's the only other guy that got significant carries and went for 7.8 yards per carry. And I'll note it's a little worse than that. The long rushes from McClellan, 34 yards. For Haynes, it was 11-yard long. And their 2 longest pass plays in this game were a 29-yarder to Bond and an 11-yarder to Burton. 13-yarder actually to Prentice. So basically, they barely ever ran the ball. 19 carries combined to their backs at Alabama. But when they did run the ball, they actually had some of their most explosive plays running, not passing, even though they didn't run it very much. And I think that does speak to a little bit the game plan and the fact that, on the Michigan end, they didn't run it great, but they had a 29-yard reception by Wilson, 38-yarder by Morris, 27-yarder by Corum. Those plays are what allowed Michigan to score and move the ball. They were a much more balanced football team. Alabama lacked balance, in my opinion. I think Alabama needed to look a lot more like everyone accused Michigan of looking like in this game. And for some reason, they stubbornly stuck to trying to be a more balanced passing team when they couldn't do it. Refused to run like 1st and 15 in the fourth quarter. They threw, I think, 3 passes in that situation. I mean, you go back and look at it statistically, there's a really good argument they probably should have just run 3 times. It might have been more likely to convert. And so that was my one real takeaway and interesting thing, is I think when you dive into those numbers, it's pretty jarring to see how much worse Alabama was at avoiding negative plays in general on a snap-to-snap basis, but also how weirdly much more effective Alabama's rushing attack was, despite the fact that it didn't really translate to anything. And I'll say that Milroe was 21 carries for 3 yards per carry, so it only looks like 4 yards per carry on the stat sheet. But that really belies everything because just the sheer number of carries and sacks that Milroe had, I think, kind of are a little deceptive for the reality of things.
Yeah, and all of what you just said, in my opinion, speaks to coaching. Alabama's staff, I think they were limited. I do think they were personnel limited, especially at quarterback, a little bit offensive line. But you still can't come in and try to play straight up for 2 quarters. They wasted the entire first half trying to run a standard traditional passing game that wasn't working, trying to play the same game they played at Georgia, but they were getting a completely different look. They reacted well, but it was in the second half. Michigan's staff came in prepared with a very specific game plan. They didn't deviate. Even when Alabama shut them out for 2 quarters, they didn't deviate, and it paid off at the beginning of the game, at the end of the game, and especially in overtime. All right, Josh, Washington, we're not taking a huge L on Michigan, Alabama, because we picked Alabama, and Alabama had the game until about a minute and a half left in the game. So if you pick that either side close, you made a good pick. We did not pick Michigan or Washington and Texas very well. I think I picked a 2-touchdown win for Texas. I think you picked something similar. I think for me, a lot of my pick had to do with conference isolation and not being able to compare across conferences to know what a win in the Pac-12 means versus what a win in the Big 12 means. And Texas having that win over Alabama data point, I think, swayed me a little bit. But really, Josh, the thing that ultimately mattered in this game is something that we ended on. And we said, if this offensive line can hold up enough against this defensive front, then it will allow Washington's pass game to thrive and they can win the game. And I think that's ultimately what happened.
Yeah, it's interesting and kind of odd to take for a variety of reasons, in my opinion. My prediction in this game, which was way off, but often a way that held a kernel of truth, but not for the reason I thought, was that Texas was going to get a pretty sizable lead early on, and then Washington would chip it away at it, because I felt like Washington throws vertically, and they got the receivers that they connect on those vertical shots. Texas's secondary was suspect, and I felt like they were going to keep connecting on big plays. And then what was going to happen at the end of the game was, did Texas have a big enough lead that they could hold Washington off or not? What we instead got was a situation where Texas came out of the gate misfiring and didn't score much at all. And Washington ended up building a lead, and it was Washington that by the third quarter had a lead, and Texas was the ones trying to come back to win the game. And I think what that really speaks to is a few things we saw or didn't see, and some of which I'm not sure are wholly repeatable. One of which is really just how effective Washington's passing game is. Now, if you're a Washington fan, you say, of course our passing game's great. We've got great receivers and a great quarterback. And I hear you, but Penix in this game had 11.3 yards per attempt. That is his highest yard per attempt average of any game since September 23rd. And Texas theoretically should have a better defense than teams like Arizona State or Southern Cal or Utah or Washington State, even Oregon, right? Like I don't think their passing defense was fantastic. In our metrics, they were hovering around somewhere still like a top 20 pass defense overall. And everybody thought that they were susceptible enough to be thrown on. People had flagged that in previews. I don't think people thought they were wholly bad. But Washington came out here, put up 430. The 430 yards is their third highest passing total. Again, the highest since mid-September. And I think all that was really surprising. And I'm not sure, sitting here today, to your point, Daniel, how much of this with conference isolation is the fact that maybe the Big 12's, maybe the Big 12 was somewhat overinflated in terms of pass defense stats, or a little shaky. Maybe there were, I know there were a lot of teams in the Big 12 that did have some issues at quarterback, even if they have pretty reasonably good statistics. It may have been sort of a weird situation where we were kind of overestimating Texas's defense relative to some of the quarterbacks and passing games they played because, contrary to normal stereotype, again, some of the offenses were kind of limited in the conference. It could be they played a bad game. It could be Washington stressed them in ways they didn't. But this is one of those games, as happens sometimes in the playoff, where we see a team put up season-high numbers on one side of the ball they haven't done before. Now, the other side, I think, is a little less forgivable for us, and that's in terms of Ewers. Now, Washington's statistics defensively were not good, and we talked about the fact that they should be susceptible through the air. But Texas at 7.4 yards per attempt is not a crazy number. They've had plenty of games like that. There was a stretch from Houston to Kansas State, where they didn't throw very well. Now, some of that is with or without a healthy Ewers. I understand that. BYU, Kansas State, he didn't play. Since then, this was the lowest number Ewers had put up. But again, before that, the Houston game, 7.3 yards per attempt. Wyoming game, he was at 6.2. They have been prone to lay out duds in the passing game. So to some degree, I'm not necessarily shocked that they misfired. We've talked all year that they are consistently inconsistent, meaning they come out, they do self-inflicted things in terms of penalties, misexecution, whatever, and that causes them to struggle offensively. But I do think it's a little interesting that you get a Texas team on the statistical side that's on the low end of things, and you get a Washington team that was really on the upper end of anything they've achieved all year. And to me, in terms of breaking this game down a little bit, is trying to make sense of that. What happened? What caused that to happen? Is this who the teams are? Or, is there something a little more behind the scenes on it? And I'm sure some of this we'll touch on the preview, but I'm trying to split up the discussion a little bit. And Daniel, I'll turn it back to you. So with that backdrop of sort of how the teams went, how the game went, how the teams performed, what do you think was the cause of all that? Do you think it means anything? Or do you think it's really just who the teams are going forward for some reason?
I mean, I think that the same thing that we talked about in the Michigan Alabama recap. Washington is a very well coached team that is very senior laden. These guys have got a ton of experience, and it showed. And Texas's front did hold up in an area that we said they would hold up, and that was in run defense. But as you said, 11 yards an attempt. I just don't. I don't know how. Like, I think that. Sorry, I'm getting a little fumbled here, but I think that the thing that Texas front is really good at is stopping the run, and it shows in all their run statistics throughout the year. They're the number 4 rushing defense, either overall or in our relative performance statistics. They're very good, but that doesn't always translate to pressuring the quarterback. And what we've seen is, one, these wide receivers are superior, and we probably definitely didn't give them enough credit, especially when coming in, the talk was about Sanders, about Worthy, about Whittington. And throughout the year as a whole, these wide receivers for Washington have outperformed them. I will also say, though, Texas was digging themselves out of a hole early, and we talked about that opening script and who wins that opening script might win the game. And Texas started out slow. I think Ewers was like 0 for 4 early, and he was the same inconsistent guy that we've seen for a while. Yes, he had 300 yards, but he threw it 43 times and only the one touchdown. So, I think that experience and consistency mattered in both of these playoff games. Now, I don't know what to make for, a preview on that because you got both those teams playing. But yeah, at some point, this super conference consolidation, for all the things that I hate about it, I love the fact that we're going to get a lot better relative data, at least within the conference, with the best teams basically moving into conferences where they have to play all of these other teams. So there might be a lot of isolation between the Big Ten and between the SEC, but within those conferences we'll at least have a lot better information. For me, it's tough because we saw Washington struggle with Washington State. I know it's a rivalry game. We saw them struggle really bad with Arizona State. We saw them struggle in the rain against Oregon State. There's really not a way to accurately and consistently predict these teams when they play across conference in a big game like this.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm going to turn back to something you said early on for purposes of the recap, which is, I had made the statement that when you went back and looked at Washington's games, their offense, particularly the passing game, did better when the run game did better. It seemed like they needed to run somewhat well to set up the pass. And I mean that, I don't really mean it the way I just said it. What I mean by that is they need the run game to exist at some level in order to keep teams honest enough that they can throw the ball down the field the way they wanted to. And what's interesting is they only ran for 2.3 yards per carry with Dylan Johnson in this game. 3.3 yards per carry as a team. 100 yards rushing, but on 31 attempts. They didn't get the run, and they threw it anyway. And Penix kind of had his Deshaun Watson in the playoffs moment from college football where I think people forget in a lot of those Clemson games, Clemson never ran the ball in Alabama in 2015 and 2016. Could barely run it at all in those games. All they did was throw. They abandoned the run completely, and they were able to meet or exceed their passing averages against Alabama in those games without a run game. And I know back then we missed those picks, I think somewhat understandably, because we said, look, if they can't run the ball at all, that Alabama 2016 defense is one of the best defenses to play in the last few decades. Didn't really necessarily feel like they were going to hold up against that defense that had what are current NFL starters, I think, at every secondary position. When you get Minkah Fitzpatrick, that's just your flex guy that says a lot about where you're at as a defense. They did it. I mean, they just continue to do it. Even without the run game, it didn't really matter. Just spread them out and tossed it down the field. And that's basically what Penix did to Texas. And
well, can I tell you, though, I think you're also kind of right there, and I'll tell you why. This stat is pretty shocking. Okay, so Penix had 31 yards in this game, 10.5 yards an attempt, 10.3 actually. He had 31 yards rushing in this game. And what did we say before this game? He doesn't run, right? With this game and these 31 yards, do you know how many yards he has rushing on the year?
No.
13. So 13 yards rushing on the season with the 31 that he got in this game. And just that little bit, just those 31 yards, really changed the game. And it's interesting because I was talking to somebody on Twitter before the game, and I said, I bet J.J. McCarthy runs the ball more or effectively in this game. Now, he didn't run as much as I thought he would, but they said really the over-under for his yardage is 15. He ran for 25 yards, and 2 of his runs were hugely impactful. And it's just, one of those was like a 3rd and 9 where they run that same kind of off-tackle thing they do with him. It was a huge pivotal moment in the game. And I think the same thing happened here. So you're kind of right in that, it's not just putting up a bunch of yards, but it is getting some wins in the run game at certain key moments or in certain ways that allows you to throw the ball.
Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to note quickly was, as quickly as I can ever be, is the Texas run game and how I felt like they were really underutilized. So Baxter and Blue combined for only 18 carries in this game, and they averaged 7.1 and 6.6 yards per carry between the two of them. They ran for 113 yards and 18 carries. That, I think, was a major misstep by Texas to not commit more to the run game. Now, a lot of it is interesting to me because there are major parallels between Alabama and Texas and why they underperformed and why they looked the way they did. Both those teams, due to negative plays, miscues, and penalties, took the run game out of the game when it was the more effective component. And Michigan played a lot of the game, and in Washington too, in a situation where they were playing for the pass and 3rd and long, and otherwise they were just sort of playing back and playing to catch. They played a lot of this game, both teams, in sort of a, almost more like a 3-3-5 mindset where they were just going to try to let you get a little bit of yardage, but they weren't going to give you any real chunk plays or explosives if they could help it, and see what happened. And when you're in those in those sorts of schemes, you can run the ball pretty effectively in early downs. But Texas, just like Alabama, couldn't keep themselves in a situation where they could run it that much, or they didn't feel like they could. But I will say, in retrospect, when you look at it statistically and look at the performance, when Baxter's at 7.1 yards per carry and Ewers is averaging 7.4 yards per attempt, you really ought to be running more. Because that's saying your run game is almost as explosive as your pass game. And your run game is certainly a lot more efficient than your pass game. So, I do want to flag the fact that I think they really outthought themselves. And maybe it does or doesn't feel like this live. But even in situations where it was like 2nd and 9, in many cases, Texas's best play call probably would have been to run the ball, not throw it. They went away from that. They became too pass happy. They were really close to 2-1 in terms of play calls pass to run. And I think that was really not in their favor. So I do think that was one of the big things in this game is they got too cute. A lot of the cuteness was earned or deserved. And Washington, I had flagged pregame. I had always been impressed by Trice. I know he wasn't always the guy that people were high on as a pass rusher, but I just felt like his motor and all was really high. And I think teams key on him offensively. And he was a huge disruptor, but a lot of that had to do with the situations Texas was in. And again, look, the last word on this maybe from me is Penix was lights out. Like he was doing the thing great quarterbacks do in the playoff, something that frankly I didn't necessarily see him doing at this level because I haven't seen him. Again, he hasn't done this statistically, consistently, whatever, on the field, off the field, on paper, in reality. On a consistent basis, he has not hit those downfield throws on and on like he did in this game. I mean, he was just on fire, could not miss. And he's hit clutch plays all year. I get that if you're a Washington fan. But he didn't miss in this game. And I have not seen him in a game really this year where he went the whole game and he couldn't miss. He went the whole game hitting those throws and he was doing it on the regular rather than just hitting them when he needed to, which is what had happened in a lot of the prior games. And that is obviously why Washington won the game, because it was a higher scoring game. But I don't know. It's an interesting one. I think this game maybe more so than the Michigan game, and this is where I'll turn it back to you, Daniel. In my mind, this is the game that I feel like you could play this game a bunch and you might get a different result each time. The Michigan game, I felt like, frankly, Alabama was probably a little lucky to have the lead in the fourth quarter and to pull it out. And if they'd done that, I felt like special teams and some other things would have given them the win in a game where they were outplayed and maybe outmatched. Just not saying you repeat the game a week from now, but just who they were going into the game. This is one where I felt like going into it and how it played out had a lot to do with what Texas did right or wrong and what Washington did. And with the inconsistencies of these teams, I do feel like you might get a little bit of a different result. And forgive me, Washington fans, for saying that. But on this night, Washington was just on in a way Texas wasn't. They were the better team that night and they pulled out the win.
Yeah, I think if Texas and Washington play 10 times, that's a 5v5 result. I think if Alabama and Michigan play 10 times, that's a 7. Michigan wins that 7 times, in my opinion. All right, y'all. Let us know in the comments what you think about our recap, whether or not we are being fair by saying that picking Alabama to win by 3 was a decent pick relative to our model that picked Michigan to win by 11 in regulation. And be on the lookout because tomorrow we will be dropping a preview for this very Washington winner, Washington and Michigan national championship game. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great day. God bless.